Growing up for me, I think I pictured Jesus as being able to like transcend any pain, like outside of maybe on the cross, which hurt. Like I didn't imagine Jesus like being sad or crying or getting angry. I just imagined him having this sort of transcendent air about him where no matter what happened, everything was fine and dandy. And that was kind of what was portrayed as the goal of what it meant to be a Christian is no matter what happened, I would be able to feel this joy that somehow made me transcend the pain and grief and depression and anxiety that I was feeling.
Yeah, I don't even know that it crossed my mind to think about what Jesus might be feeling.
Hmm.
I didn't even identify that myself, so I don't think I was thinking about that for
Hmm.
what I thought about Jesus. I think a lot of what I thought about was the things he did versus how he did them or how he interacted with people.
All right, well, thanks for tuning in for the first episode of our podcast about Jesus and mental health. And so to start off, just wanted to kind of talk about what our hopes are for this podcast. This is something that we're doing separate from our like Sunday messages that we also put on podcasts. But for me, this podcast really is aimed to be the voice that I needed to hear when I was really in the throes of depression and wanted to hear that somebody else understood what I was going through. Carly, what are your hopes for this podcast?
I don't know. I think I'm just really excited to get to do this. I've always wanted to do a podcast, first of all. And then also just these conversations aren't often conversations we hear surrounding faith. And so not that we have all the answers or that we're experts by any means, but I'm excited to at least have conversations about these things and how they intersect with our faith.
For sure. So let's talk about some things that this podcast is, or hopefully will be, and some things that it is not. So it is a conversation, not a sermon. It is a conversation by people who've studied about these things and experienced these things, but also not by mental health professionals. We encourage you to go see a therapist, a doctor, get holistic care, all of that type of stuff. It is aimed at being hopeful. It's aimed at being vulnerable. It's not aimed at giving you all the answers, though hopefully sparking some good questions. What might you add to that about what it is? And
I think you covered everything as far as I know.
all right, great, sweet. So thought we'd start out this podcast episode with something fun. Who do you think can cry first?
I don't know. I've never actually seen you cry. You talk about crying a lot, but I don't
feel
think
like I've cried
I've...
at a sermon.
Not that I've ever noticed.
What? Your husband's come up to me like twice and said, "Thank you for crying, Trey." You're welcome.
Maybe I just didn't notice. I don't know.
You're probably up there playing piano and making me cry.
Yeah, probably behind you.
That's
I
probably
couldn't
what
see
it
you.
was. So each episode we're kind of going to cover a slightly different topic, but to intro it, I wanted to talk about something that I think is really important and sometimes overlooked, which is Jesus has emotions. Sounds really, really simple, but I don't know about you, but growing up for me, I think I pictured Jesus as being able to like transcend any pain, like outside of maybe on the cross, which hurt. Like I didn't imagine Jesus like being sad or crying or getting angry. I just imagined him having this sort of transcendent air about him where no matter what happened, everything was fine and dandy. And that was kind of what was portrayed as the goal of what it meant to be a Christian is no matter what happened, I would be able to feel this joy that somehow made me transcend the pain and grief and depression and anxiety that I was feeling.
Yeah, I don't even know that it crossed my mind to think about what Jesus might be feeling. I didn't even identify that myself, so I don't think I was thinking about that for what I thought about Jesus. I think a lot of what I thought about was the things he did versus how he did them or how he interacted with people. And so a lot of miracles or the stories that we hear where he's, how he treats children and all of those things, but not necessarily like, I don't remember learning about when he turned over the tables in the temple. I don't remember learning about, I'm sure I did at some point, but it didn't register if I did.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. What were you taught about emotions?
I was taught that they were not to be trusted and that they were just sort of there, but we were supposed to use rational thought to push past them. I don't know if some of it was spoken to me in that way, and a lot of it was just things I picked up on, I think, by the people around me.
Sure. What do you think about that now?
Oh, I think that's a horrible way to approach your emotions because I've been terrified of them for so long, and even now it's really hard as an adult trying to relearn that they're okay, and they're indicators to us that something's going on, and they're not to be just the only thing that we use to make decisions or to have conversations out of those things, but they are important indicators to us that are not to be ignored. And if we do ignore them, they're going to come out.
Yeah, I've definitely had that happen. Yeah, which was hard, right? If you're a person who, I've always been kind of a more emotional, sensitive guy. And so that was hard. If like I'm not supposed to be emotional, then that meant that I wasn't really a good Christian or a good person. And I think sometimes that was more implicit in teaching than explicit. I did hear things like don't trust your emotions, like all the language about not trusting your heart, which I think is good advice generally, but it needs to be nuanced, like the understanding we are made in God's image and he did make us with emotions. Our heart is deceitful and we can't always trust our emotions, but the subtext, and this is a conversation for a different podcast episode, but is that we can fully trust our thoughts as being totally logical and not being influenced by emotions, which at least my working hypothesis about the internet is that it's just a bunch of emotions bubbling up as thoughts. So I don't think it's totally accurate to say that we can not be influenced by emotions, nor do I think it's good. There's a book that you and I have both been looking at some, which is called Why Emotions Matter by Tristan Collins and Jonathan Collins. And they talk about emotions being a dashboard. And I think that's helpful, like a dashboard for a car to indicate that there's something going on that needs to be paid attention to. That emotions aren't necessarily inherently always good or always bad. There's value in all these different emotions. There's also dangers with all of them. And for me, that was really helpful to think about, even in context of what we're going to talk about today, which is an example of Jesus feeling emotion, is that when he weeps, he's God, so him weeping here is fully justified and the right thing to do and not sinful. Mm-hmm. But weeping always isn't the most appropriate response either. So
yeah, I think the problem is we try to separate it and compartmentalize ourselves, but we talk a lot about being a whole being.
Sure. And
so understanding that it's all interconnected is a huge part of even figuring out what your thoughts or emotions are. It's both and, it's not one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, and everybody experiences it different. So maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, I don't know that I ever feel grief or sad, but you might feel like a pit in your stomach. Or for me, I feel stress in my shoulders. Or you might not feel like you are an anxious person, but have you ever felt really jittery and on edge? That can also be anxiety bubbling up. And so I think that's part of what makes this conversation important and difficult, is that it's also nuanced and integrated, that we're whole beings. It's not just a spiritual thing. It's not just a physical thing. It's not just an emotional thing. All of that kind of works together. So I want to look at this passage today. It's a passage that as a kid, I remember in middle school, people would joke and say that they had a Bible verse memorized. And they would always say, oh, I have a Bible verse memorized. And they'd say, Jesus wept. And it was always really funny, like, oh, I've got the Bible verse memorized, whatever. And I don't know why I also thought, like, oh, that's funny, like, I've got a Bible verse memorized, Jesus wept, when actually those two words have been some super incredibly encouraging words for me in the midst of hard times, and words that I think are applicable to ministry, words that I think are just encouraging about life and grief and about all this stuff. That's two words that have so much depth in them. But for some reason, I always kind of just like glossed over it. It's like, short verse, Jesus wept.
Well, I think as a kid, weeping is terrifying. And so anything we're afraid of, a lot of times we make a joke about it, or we find a way to laugh at it because it feels a lot easier to just sort of dismiss it and to laugh at something than to reconcile what that means about me if Jesus is weeping.
Yeah, that's true.
And middle schoolers are so awkward. Like, we're not going to talk about... I cry sometimes. Like, you're not going to admit that to your friends in middle school, most likely.
Probably not.
At least not in our generation.
No.
So,
and for guys too, I think one of the interesting subtexts I think we'll have as we talk through emotions over this podcast is stereotypically different emotions that are more accessible or more widely recognized for men and for women. At least my experience growing up, tears, sadness was not one that I was supposed to feel. Big boys don't cry kind of language, which was really hard because as a big boy, like I still cry a lot. And so that took some, and still takes some working through. But yeah, I think that's good not to just listen to blanketly what middle schoolers say.
They didn't handle it in a mature way. I'm shocked.
Yeah, me too. So let's talk about this story. It's from John chapter 11. So this is where Jesus' friend Lazarus is sick and he dies. But in verse 4 of the beginning of this passage, Jesus hears about Lazarus being sick. And in verse 4 he says, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. Then in verse 5, so although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. So I want to pause there because sometimes I think we jump really quickly to the resolution of the story where everything's good and Lazarus is back alive. And we're going to get to that, and it's beautiful and amazing, and it shows Jesus' power over death and all that stuff. But I can't help but think of how Mary and Martha must have felt when they sent Jesus a message saying, hey, my brother is sick. And Jesus, even though he loved them, just stayed where he was. Not just for a minute, but for several days. And I don't know about you, I've definitely felt like that with God. I'm like, hey, are you there? Are you there? Like, crying out to you, I'm praying, I'm reading my Bible, I'm doing all the right stuff. Like, where are you? Why don't you show up? And it seems like comes too late.
Yeah. I think so much of the timing that we put on God obviously is from our framework of timing, and we want it to be in our timing. We want that control as well, especially with something as devastating as this. Like, they're losing their brother.
Yeah.
And and they have access. They know they have access to the one who has authority over death and over sickness. And to then still, I don't know, we don't get all the details. We don't know if there was a message sent back to them or like any sort of response from Jesus. Here it looks like they didn't know anything. He just came 2 days later, which I don't know how that works. But yeah, oftentimes you feel like you get silence from God.
Yeah.
And then the movement comes and you're like, wait, what do I do with that time where I felt like there was nothing?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because, like, I don't know, people talk to about God's timing is perfect, and I want to make a quick caveat there too. Sometimes people use that as a way of trying to encourage people who are going through grief, and maybe there's a time and place to say that type of thing, but also sometimes it's really frustrating and annoying. Like, God's timing's perfect, or God does everything in his own time, or maybe it's their time to go, or like whatever the thing is. And it's like, most times that's not really that.
You probably shouldn't say that to people. I'm just gonna say that.
Yeah, for sure. But we see, like, so in verse 15, Jesus says, and for your sakes, so this is to the disciples, so, which is interesting, it's not to Mary and Martha, but for the disciples. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. Mm-hmm. So Jesus made this promise to them. Lazarus wasn't going to, like, stay dead, at least. And we'll see in a little bit that happens, but we see that actually by the time Jesus gets to where Mary and Martha were, Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. The King James Version of verse 39 says that by this time he stinketh. Mm-hmm. Like, the smell will be terrible is what the New Living Translation says. And this is significant, like that it was 4 days and not just 2, because there's this tradition that we learn about from Jewish history that says the soul of someone who was recently deceased would hover around the body for 3 days, hoping to re-enter. And so 4 days makes it really, really clear Lazarus wasn't just like kind of dead, maybe dead, just asleep, sick, in a coma. No, Lazarus was like full on, certifiably dead, so much so that he stinketh. Like, it makes it really, really clear. Like, if there's any doubt, did Jesus raise this guy from the dead? He did. His body stunk. So when Jesus gets to see Mary and Martha, Martha goes to meet him, and she says in verse 21, Lord, if you only had been here, my brother would not have died. I mean, that's a really profound thing to say. It's a statement. It has like a couple components to it for me. One, it's ridden with faith. Like, I know you could. That's faith, at least to me. And she knew Jesus was full of the power to be able to heal the sick and do all this stuff. If you had just shown up, you could have. She may have felt like Jesus let her down. I don't know. I don't want to read too much into her emotions, but that had to be so hard. Like, having a personal, like, physical connection with Jesus. And if you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened. Having faith, but also, like, you didn't do the thing that I know you could do. And we're friends. Right? I've definitely felt like that.
Yeah, that feels a little too relatable for me, I think, at this point. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think any person that has walked in faith long enough and has gone through hardship or tragedy or things that don't make sense in our brain, when you cry out to Jesus and he doesn't do what you want him to do or think he should do, or even a lot of times you're like, you would get so much glory if you did this thing, and it's so mysterious what gets answered and what doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, because for every Lazarus, well, there's like 7 billion Johns and Sarahs who that doesn't happen for. Now, I mean, of course, we got the concept of eternity and Jesus raising all who follow him from the dead, but like, most of us, when we cry out to God in grief for something like that, we're not going to get this response. Could he? Yeah, I believe he can, but why he doesn't always is way beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, and I do have to think that a lot of it has to do with that tension of like, here in this passage, he was on the earth. And so physically, tangibly, he was there. Here, he is, yes, here, but also there's this reality of what is to come. And knowing that, Lazarus, I always say Lazarus instead of Lazarus. Lazarus as well, like he died at some point, he's not still alive on the earth that we know of, but
that's a good point.
That's what I think I've always thought about that in this passage, like, yes, he lived, but for how much longer, and then what, when he actually did die, was he then like, let's do it again, Jesus, or was he just content to know that he would be meeting his Savior?
Yeah, and think of the function of this story too in the Gospel of John. This is shortly before Jesus is betrayed, and the religious leaders get really upset with him over this thing, which is kind of a strange thing to be upset with somebody over. I feel like, you raise somebody from the dead. How dare you do that? It's more nuanced than that, and the claims that he made about being resurrection and life and being God. But still, this story goes not only to advance like the story of Lazarus and meet them, but also to advance who he is and proclaim that he has the power and authority over death, which is showcased really more so on the cross and then through the resurrection. And so I think that's the hard part too, is it's not just Lazarus's story or just Mary and Martha's story, is that, but more so it's God's story that he is orchestrating and demonstrating, and we all are a part of this massive story that we don't fully get the glimpse into what all is happening in that, which is hard. Verse 22, we even see their faith. She says, Martha does, but even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. She's still like holding on to faith. And Jesus told her, your brother will rise again. And then Martha's like, yeah, he'll rise when everyone rises at the last day. And what she's referring to here is this idea of the future resurrection, where all God's people will rise from the dead and live forever with God. And so we talk about this in terms of like the new city that God's making, when those who follow Jesus will live forever with God, and there'll be no more pain, suffering, cancer, all that stuff will be done away with. And she believes that. But Jesus tells her, verse 25, that presently I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? She says she does, and then sends for Mary. Mary finds him, falls at his feet, and says basically kind of the same thing. Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died. I know I've been there, on your knees. And verse 33 tells us that Mary was weeping. And the word that's used there was not just like a, silently crying, but like wailing. Loud, ugly, unconsolable type tears. And I'll just speak for me as a guy, those types of ones are a little bit harder for me to deal with and not feel embarrassed by. But what we're going to see as we go through
those types of cries. Can you clarify? Okay.
Yeah, those type of cries. Yeah, where I'm snotty faced and puffy faced and weeping.
Well, I can say as a woman, I don't like them either. So
that's fair.
I don't know if it has to do with
that's fair. That's a good point.
Gender or not, but yeah. I think Martha and Mary are so relatable in this. Because there's a part of us that knows, those of us who believe in this, there's a part of us that knows, yeah, it's going to be better on the other side. But I still want that person here. I want them here. And so, yes, they even say here, each of them separately, they believe that there will one day be a time where we all raise together again. I think both of them said it, maybe not. Regardless, they know that. yet they want Lazarus in the flesh, here and now on the earth. In a time where, like, life didn't seem that great. I don't know. It didn't seem that great in that culture. And life in general is just very hard. But we know that there's a future reality, but the present reality is so much more in our face and so much more where we are with our thoughts and our feelings and what we want and our desires. And so I think it's so relatable to be like, yeah, I know he would technically be better off where he just went, but like we want him here.
Yeah. I don't know about you. I've definitely been in the place, I think of quite a few moments, like in really dark periods of depression, where I'm like, I don't really care that it's coming in the future. I want it now.
Yeah. It is present suffering or long suffering, which is what we're kind of in here, whether we fully recognize it or not, is really, really hard on a minute-by-minute basis, a day-by-day basis to reconcile. Or however much it comes up in your life that you feel like, okay, I feel this really hard today, that this is, we're here just suffering.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know, I remember quite a few times in my life where I was like, okay, also like with the world being so difficult as it is oftentimes, and when you're really, really struggling, it's like, if this is what life even is, like, do I even, like, eternal life? Like, why is that great?
Do you ever think about forever and it freaks you out?
Yeah.
Also, that freaks me out.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, it's so hard to even imagine what that will be like because it is so real here.
Yeah.
Or like the little things that happen in your relationships where you're like, that person, I don't know if I can say pissed me off. That person pissed me off today.
Yeah.
And having to, like, that won't be.
Yeah. It's weird. Yeah, it's a very strange concept to think about because I don't think we can totally get our minds around it. And like and what I love about narratives in the Bible, one of the many things, is that there's so much underneath the text, particularly when we start getting into these conversations like we're having around what were they feeling? Were they disappointed? Were they still hopeful? Were they both? Were they angry? Were they sad? Was it all of the above? Which would probably be my guess. But like thinking about that in context of us too, it's like I often have a whole range of those emotions when I approach God, and I'm wrestling. I'm like, all right, I'm simultaneously hopeful that you will show up, and I'm also simultaneously like really doubting that you're even there because I've been praying a lot, and surely at this point you would have heard me. I've been pretty loud and vocal and maybe rude and nice. I've gone about all the routes that I can think of. You know what I mean? Like, surely at some point he would respond. And Jesus, obviously in this story, he goes to raise Lazarus from the dead, which is beautiful and amazing. And I can't help but wonder, what did Mary and Martha think later on in Lazarus' life, if they were around when Lazarus died? Were they like, is he gonna do it again? Or were they like, wow, he did it again. He did it earlier, and now like we can celebrate that one day Lazarus will be raised and everything will be good. That's probably what I think happened, but I can't help but wonder with that. And one of the beautiful things in this story for me is, going back to what we said at the beginning, is that in between the promise that Jesus made and the promise that Jesus kept, Jesus wept. Two little words that have such profound power. Because I think about, this idea that I heard a lot growing up of even grown men don't cry. And I'm like, well, Jesus was a grown man, and he certainly wept. And I'm pretty sure Jesus was more of a grown-up man than I am. And if he did that, then surely it's not inherently sinful for me to weep or cry. At least not always. Like, if Jesus did it, it was the most appropriate and best response for any human to do at that given point. And he wept. So sometimes the most obedient and faithful to Jesus thing I can do is to weep in response to whatever is going on.
Yeah, and it's not just to weep. He's not just weeping on his own. He is sitting in the pain with the people. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the part that we really miss. And I think why you hear a lot of these blanket statements like, oh, well, maybe they're better off. Maybe it was their time, or at least this, or at least that. Whatever the thing is that you're about to say, that you just are quickly going to write off somebody else's pain. Jesus doesn't do that. Even though he knows he's about to flip it all on its head.
Yeah.
That's the thing that's so interesting too, because his timing is like he is able to be fully present with them in this moment, even knowing the magnitude of what he is about to do.
Yeah. And
we don't get to do the things that he did, right? We aren't God, so we can't do the magnitude of, we have all authority in Christ, but we don't do the things that he did fully.
Yeah.
And so I think what's so important here is the reason he's weeping. And yes, he's sad for his friend Lazarus, but I think even more so, he is caught up with what Mary and Martha are feeling, and he is right there with them.
Yeah.
And I see that throughout Scripture so much, like
sure.
the mourning of passing in such a different way than we handle any of that.
Oh yeah, like long periods of mourning and grief with specific instructions on how to go about doing it for a lengthy period of time.
With your community.
Yes.
And now we go to the funeral or we send flowers or we send a meal, and then we just we're like, all right, I'm done with that. And having gone through that type of grief and realizing how alone you feel for so long, and realizing how long it goes on, it doesn't just end. It's gonna always be a part of me.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting to watch the way that people interact with you when you've gone through grief. And I think a lot of it is because we deny our own emotions. And so if you're in that kind of pain, I don't want to admit that I could potentially be in that kind of pain. And so I'm just going to brush that off, leave you with something, and then go about my merry way. Instead of walking in, getting on the floor with that person and weeping, or holding them, or whatever the thing is, just being there. Not saying anything, just being there.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I don't know about you, but I mean, and mine's, different with depression, because there's so many, a range of feelings around, like the sadness and whatever that I felt in addition to anger. And I would belittle myself for feeling the things that I felt or feel. Speak more presently. Why don't you feel differently than you do now? So when someone else comes in and says something that makes you feel like, why don't you feel differently than you do now? That does the opposite of help. I'm reminded of a song by, I think it's Patrick Droney. I think it's called Glitter, but he refers to grief as glitter. That just like glitter, no matter how hard you try to clean it up from everything, you will always find it somewhere on things that were a part of your life at that time, or it will pop up randomly and you're like, oh, why is my hand still like got a little sparkle on it? Because the glitter sticks. And I think grief and pain is a lot like that. It's not this just like, cool, wash my hands of it, I'm done. It's goes in waves and seasons and comes up really strongly. And it's not just sadness, it's also like sadness, but maybe anger, sometimes hope, sometimes hopelessness, sometimes joy and remembrance. It's all the things.
Yeah, and I think we live in a culture that's like, you shouldn't stay there. Do whatever you can to not stay there. And it's kind of easy, to lose myself in a Netflix show or get on social media, which always makes me feel so good about myself.
Isn't that right?
Or, whatever the thing is that helps you shake that. Maybe it's food or drink or whatever your drug of choice is. It's more accessible now than I think it's ever been. And so what do we do when we're denying ourselves parts of our humanity?
Yeah. And what's so hard, I feel like, at least for me, is like when you stop running to those vices, those drugs of choice, as you call them, which, just to state too, like Netflix or social media or whatever, like not inherently, well, sometimes I think they're inherently bad, but not actually inherently bad. They can be good, and sometimes you need to distract yourself. But for me, when I stopped running to those as much, it actually got worse before it got better, because I needed to not run away from or just numb. At some point, I needed to walk through. And I fear that when we don't allow people or ourselves to walk through the emotions that we need to walk through, we actually miss out on so much of what Jesus is doing, which is meeting people in the midst of pain, like he does here. I mean, in the beginning of the Gospels, right, he's referred to in some of them as Emmanuel, God with us, which like sounds beautiful and cool, and we just usually mean he came in human flesh. But like, he was acquainted with deepest grief, as Isaiah says, a man of sorrows. So why would I not think that he would meet me in the midst of that and form me and shape me and walk with me and sit with me when I don't know what the heck is happening, why it's happening, and I may not know.
Not only that, but he created us to be emotional beings. He gave us those so that we could walk through what we were going to walk through. I mean, I hate sadness. I do. That's a really tough one for me. But also, if you don't feel sadness, how do you wrestle through something hard or something that makes you sad? But I can't even say it without saying that word because it's so hard to think about. If we didn't actually have those indicators, what would life be like?
Yeah. I mean, it isn't in some ways a response like sadness or anger or one of those, a proper and good, even potentially holy response to when everything around us or when things in the world are broken and messed up and decaying, being destroyed, when we see things in the news that are heartbreaking. Wouldn't it be an inappropriate, ungodly response to just like go on and just continue being happy and not weep with those who weep, mourn with those who mourn, and use that as fuel even to work towards change?
Yeah, I mean, anger and sadness should lead us towards justice. And sadness should lead us towards compassion for others. And joy and happiness should also lead us toward celebration and gratefulness and thanksgiving. And when we deny ourselves the full reality of what those are, they can't lead us to anything. If we're so busy trying to stamp them out, then we're missing out on the fullness and the wholeness of what it means to be here on this earth and fully human.
And if we think about, I think a good way to think about sin sometimes is that it's dehumanizing, not treating someone else or yourself or responding to God in a way of what it means to be human, which is to be made in the image of God. And so in that sense, perhaps it's sinful not to like allow those things to become integrated into who we are created to be, because God made us with those emotions. In this story, there's one other thing in here that I find fascinating. In verse 33, it says that when Jesus saw her, referring to Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. But perhaps a more literal version of this says that he was angry, or that a deep anger welled up within him. And that's shortly before Jesus weeps. And when I read that initially, and I tried studying that and looking at the Greek and like reading commentaries, that one really bothered me. I feel like I'm more comfortable with sadness than anger. I'm kind of afraid of anger and have a harder time with that one and seeing where it's right, even though I know Jesus was angry, and I think anger can be really helpful and important. Sadness is a little bit easier for me to understand and get behind. And like seeing Jesus weep, I'm like, praise God, like I need that, But like he was deeply moved, and like I was like, all right, I'm gonna come up with some way to think of him as not being angry. But as far as I could tell, every other place in the New Testament that word is translated in reference to anger.
Can you clarify what he's angry about?
So that's where the debate comes in.
Okay.
As far as like the theological conversation, it's people don't know. Why was he angry? Some people would say he's angry at sin and death and what it has done to his friends, Mary and Martha. Some people would say he's angry. It references these Jews that were there. And functionally in the Gospel of John, this text also goes to make the religious leaders really mad. So is he angry at them who are weeping with these people here, but then actually get really upset with him for raising Lazarus from the dead and claiming to be the resurrection and the life? We don't totally know, but I've come to think that actually is really beautiful, that we don't totally know all the things undergirding Jesus is being deeply moved in his spirit, the anger, the weeping. We just know that those were the outward responses, I guess, besides it being deeply moved in his spirit. I don't know all the things that were underneath there, but how beautiful is that too? Because so often when I'm weeping or when I'm angry or deeply moved in here, which might be a mix of sadness and anger and I don't know what else, I don't always have words to express the fullness of what's going on. And I think it's really beautiful that we have an example here of Jesus that is like, I wonder what all was going on in there. Was it a conglomeration of all these things? That my grief or whatever doesn't have to be justified by me being able to give a good enough explanation of it or explain it well enough in words, which, side comment, is incredibly difficult to do when you are ugly crying. Like, what's wrong? I don't know. I don't know what's wrong. I think it's this. And you're like, no, that sounds dumb. That's not what it is. That can't be it. But maybe. It's beautiful to me that we don't fully know.
I think it's interesting because, at least for me, which I can only speak from my experience, but anger and sadness are so closely tied.
Say more about that.
I think, like, a lot of times before I cry, I'm very angry, and then I cry. And so I don't, and this isn't fully fleshed out because I didn't know what we'd be talking about, but I think anger accompanies a lot of emotions, and I've even heard it said it's a secondary emotion that sort of indicates that something else is going on.
Interesting.
Whether that be fear or sadness or whatever the thing is. And so I think when you are sad, it's easy also to feel angry about all the things you just mentioned, right? Angry that I have to be sad. Angry that whatever the thing I'm sad about isn't as it should be. Angry that
that you are sad. Angry at yourself.
Yes, yeah. Angry at whoever caused the sadness, or if somebody was the cause of that. And so I think it's interesting that that's in here because, at least for me, those things are very closely tied.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to have to think about that one some more.
But, I mean, there could be a lot of reasons for that. Like, I'm on the anger triad if you look at the Enneagram and all of that, too. So, I don't know if other people experience it that way or not. But I have a lot of anger that I deny in myself, and then it boils up, and then it usually leads to something that I'm actually in pain about or sad about.
Yeah, I think that just all, goes to say emotions in our holistic being and holistic formation into becoming who we're made to be is so integrated and nuanced and
right, as I was saying earlier, it's not like one or the other, it's all of it. And so I think even as you were talking about like what it means to ugly cry, and of course you can't name what's going on inside of you at that moment because literally your body is releasing whatever it is. And a lot of times our body knows things before we know them, at least for me as well. You know, when my shoulders won't go down, I'm like, oh, I must be really stressed. You know, like sometimes because I carry my stress right there too. Or maybe, you know, your body is, I don't know. I think your body is also closely tied to those things as well. And so I think it's all of it together.
Yeah. It reminds me of Romans chapter 12 that talks about presenting your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. It's always kind of weird to me, but thinking about it's about our whole being, and it's hard to have words around all of that too, because with mental health stuff, which we'll get into this in a different episode in regard to holistic care, but like sometimes it is just straight or like mainly biological, like it's chemical in your brain. Sometimes it is more directly what we deem spiritual, and oftentimes it's
all of it.
It's like all of it. Sometimes maybe more one than the other. So sometimes we feel it and we can't give words because there might not be words. Our body is just doing something, and maybe that's what our body needs.
And if I'm to that emotional point, I'm usually overwhelmed. So you know, it is your body just sort of rupturing and just being like, here's a way to release the pressure, almost like a pressure cooker.
So as we kind of wrap up this episode, what would be one like takeaway that you would love people to leave this first conversation with?
I think that Jesus is a deeply personal God. And he doesn't want you to tinker and tailor yourself to be a certain version of you before you can approach him. He is there. He is. And so it just kind of breaks my heart to think about people trying to rid themselves of emotions and trying to ditch those, especially in the name of faith, or thinking that that's something that Jesus wants from you. Because we know Jesus was fully human and fully God and perfect, and he weeps and he's angry and he's experiences the same things that we experience. And so in this, knowing that yes, he is there, and also just like Mary and Martha, he is okay with you coming to him and saying why. And if you were here, this wouldn't have happened.
That's good. I've done that a lot. I think for me, if I was to sum it up, maybe, or one takeaway for me would be that we can't just skip the middle of the story. That it's easy for me when I think about faith, and particularly growing up, thinking about the beginning, everything was good, sin, things are bad. And then Jesus comes, I can have life, an eternal life. And in the end, everything's great. But like so much of the scriptures is people struggling and wrestling and wondering where God is and feeling pain and messing up and God forgiving and crying out to God and not knowing what they think, and it's messy and it's sometimes unclear and it's hard and exhausting and all the things. And so I think for me would be just that it's important when it comes to the context of faith, and particularly like believing and following Jesus, that knowing like this side of eternity, most of our story is in the middle, not at the end. And we work towards making his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, so that's like kind of bringing the end into the middle. But yeah, I think just if Jesus wept, it's okay for you to weep too. Don't just try to act at the end when it's not the end yet. We're still in the middle. And that's okay, that's where we are.